Hello, welcome to Naresh Technologies. This is Sudhakar Sharma. We are continuing our session of ADO.NET Entity Framework. In our previous sessions of ADO.NET Entity Framework, we discussed about the basic architecture of ADO.NET Entity Framework, what are the major components of Entity Framework, and we discussed about the ADO.NET Entity Framework library, means what are all the basic classes required to handle database manipulations by using ADO.NET Entity Framework. We discussed about the classes like entity classes and component model data annotations which are used for Entity Framework. And what is the key concept about ADO.NET Entity Framework we discussed. Entity Framework introduces multiple modeling techniques like code first approach, database first approach and model first approach. Today in this session we are going to deal with code first approach. So, we will see how to handle ADO.NET Entity Framework code first approach in ASP.NET MVC. So, we will create an ASP.NET MVC application with code first approach. The code first approach is very simple here. We define all the domain specific classes, and according to the domain specific classes we call them as POCO classes. Entity Framework will create the database and tables. That means you are not writing for database, you are writing according to the business requirements, everything domain specific. Whatever you written for the domain specific and business requirements, for that Entity Framework will generate all the database and tables. So, in code first approach of Entity Framework, we are going to create a database and tables by using the domain specific classes. Let us see how we can handle this code first approach. For that, I will first show you our database management system, SQL Server Management Studio. In SQL Server databases in my machine, you can observe we have the databases category and a list of few databases here available in my machine. Now, what we will try to do is we will try to create a database by using business specific classes. Here you can observe the database, these are all the various databases available. We will try to create a database called Northwind. Any database you can do, but I am using this Northwind database because it is a traditional database used by Microsoft for categories and products like information to manage and maintain. So, we will create our own Northwind database, and the database will contain a list of categories and products. So, we are trying to create categories and products table. We are trying to communicate with the categories and products table in Northwind database by using our domain specific classes. So, there is no database here you can see in the list by name Northwind. We will keep this like that, so that we are now going to create the database with our business logic. Let us do that. So, I will keep my database aside, switch to Visual Studio, and we are working with an empty MVC application here. In this empty MVC application, already we discussed in our MVC sessions how to create an empty MVC application. In empty MVC application, the application is not enabled with Entity Framework. You have to install Entity Framework for your application to use. You can see in the references of this Entity Framework code first approach. In the references there is no Entity Framework initialized. So, you have to install Entity Framework in order to use Entity Framework in an empty application. Let us first install Entity Framework. To install Entity Framework, you can download it from NuGet packages. So, right click on references. In the references you will find manage NuGet packages. Select manage NuGet packages. It will open a NuGet package manager, and in the NuGet package manager you can go to the category browse, because already some packages are installed here, but in the installed packages we do not have entity framework. So, we can search that. I will search for entity framework, and there is no entity framework. It says that no packages found. That means in installed packages there is no entity framework. Then we browse, means we will go online. Who is the package provider? NuGet. So, it will connect with the official nuget.org. It will download the package from that source. So, we will go and search online for this package. So, I will click on browse. It is searching for entity framework, and you can see the entity framework library is there. So, we need to install this entity framework. So, let us select entity framework, and this entity framework, you can see right side you have an install button. NuGet package will provide the latest version available. It is the stable version, and you can select the older versions also, that if your Visual Studio is using any older version. So, here I will install the latest version for our MVC. So, click on install button. So, when I click on install button, it will first connect with the source, and it is asking to review the changes. That means it is asking to confirm whether to install or not. I will click on OK. This will ask us to accept the terms from Microsoft. Let us accept the terms. Now, this will download, and you can see in the status it is adding the entity framework package to your application, and once it is successfully added, then it will show you the message finished. No errors are there in installing the package. So, we installed entity framework for our Visual Studio, so that we can start working with entity framework. Now, let us check in our project whether this is available or not. So, first I will switch to the Solution Explorer. In the Solution Explorer, go to References, and in the References you can see we have the entity framework library available now. We have the entity framework library available. So, now application is ready to use entity framework. So, the first step in our approach is create an empty MVC application and install ADO.NET entity framework for your application. You can install from NuGet package manager. You can go online, search for entity framework and download from the NuGet package manager. So, once it is installed, once confirm whether it is added or not, you can confirm that from the package config file. You can go to the package config file. In the package config file, you will find the list of all the packages that are available here, and you can see the entity framework is also available here to use. So, the first step is ready. That means your application is ready to use entity framework. So, now what we want to do exactly is, now we want to use some business classes, we want to write some domain classes. These classes will be responsible for interacting with the database, but database is not yet ready, database is not there. Now, by using the domain classes, these business classes, we are going to create the database and the tables. If database and tables are later ready, these classes will be responsible for interacting with it. The default approach for entity framework is code first. That means it will try to create the database. Let us see how we can do that. So, first, to communicate with any data source, we have to write the connection string in the web config file. So, I will switch to the web config file. You can see this is the web config file. In the web config file, I will write the connection string here. So how do we define the connection strings? We can add the connection string. I am adding the connection string here, connection strings. In the connection strings, we are adding a connection string add name. Name of the connection string I will give as a north wind connection. North wind connection is the connection string name, and the provider is our SQL server, then system.data.sql client, and we have the connection string data source. Data source is the PC name, server name. My server name is admin PC, okay, and we want the database name as initial catalog, okay. The database name here, very important, is there is no database. We are assuming that database will be by this name. So I will give the database name as Northwind DB, okay, that is the database name. Authentication, user ID, SA, and the password is 123. That's fine. So that means what we are exactly doing here is, after installing entity framework, we are writing the connection string in the web config file. The connection string name is Northwind connection, and the provider name is SQL client. Connection string is data source, my server name. Initial catalog is Northwind DB, and see the interesting point here, there is no Northwind DB already in my databases. So we are giving everything as per the business requirement. So that means later it will create a database by name Northwind DB, which will have all these database and tables, whatever you are defining in your business logic, and it's using the user ID SA and password 123. Okay, once you define the connection strings, we need all the classes that are responsible for the databases, and already we learnt in our MVC framework that the classes that are responsible to interact with the database are defined in a special folder called models. So I will close the web config file. Let's go to the folder models. You can go to the folder models. Now in the models folder, we need to add the classes that are responsible for interacting with the database. So in MVC framework, model contains all the data access logic, communication with database, representing the database, all these classes will be here. Now in our database, we want two tables, one is for categories, another for products. So we need to create two classes, those will represent the categories table and the products table. So let's add a class in the models. Right click on models, go to add and select add new class. Let's give a name for the class. I will give the class name as category. Category is the class name. Okay, let's add this class into models. Now the class category is defined in the namespace entity code first dot models. So what this category class is doing here, it is going to represent the categories table in the Northwind database. So what fields you want in the Northwind database that you have to define here. So I am adding some properties. One property so is a public int category ID. So let's set it as a property get set accessors. Another one public string name, a get set accessor. Okay. So let's give it as a category name. So we have two properties in the categories, one category ID and category name. Now our intention is this class should map to a database table in SQL Server. How a C# class will map to a database table? How these fields will map to those database fields, table fields? For that we discussed about a namespace, a separate library, that is data annotations. Data annotations will provide some set of attributes which are responsible to design the classes in such a way so that they are mapped to the database tables. Now we have to use those attributes and design our class in such a way so that it will map to a database table. So I need two classes here to use. So I am importing those namespaces for them using system.componentModel.dataAnnotations.schema. In our previous session, earlier session of entity framework, we discussed about component model data annotations. Two annotations are there: schema annotations, model annotations. Schema annotations are responsible for defining the structure of the table. Model annotations are used for defining the model fields. So we need two namespaces here: schema, another one using system.componentModel.dataAnnotations. Now the first important is this categories table should map to a database table. Then I have to mark with an attribute called table. I will define the table name as TBL categories. So what's the important point here is the categories table is going to have the fields like category ID and category name. The name of the table in the database will be TBL categories. So you created a class called category, but it is mapping to a database table called TBL categories. And in the table we want category ID as the primary key. Then I will mark this category ID with an attribute key. So that means now this is designated as a primary key in the table. So what's the database to be created? Database will be created by name Northwind, and in the database one table will be added by name TBL categories. This table will have two fields, category ID and category name, where category ID will be designated as the primary key. So we are creating our domain classes which will map to a database table. If the table is there, it will interact with the table. If it is not there, you can define the strategy in such a way so that it can even create the table. Okay, let's add one more table for that. So I am adding one more class into models. This time I defined the class name as a product. One class for categories, another class for product. I am adding one more class for the product. Okay. Now this product class should have some members like public, int, product ID. Let's use a get set accessor for that. Another string name. So get set, and another decimal. So let's put a decimal type price and get set accessor. Okay. So that means now products will have three fields. One is product ID, the product name, and the product price. Now let's map this to the database table. Then same, using system.componentModel.dataAnnotations.schema. Another library using system.componentModel. We added the data annotations, one component model data annotations schema, another one component model data annotations, and let's mark these annotations, use those annotations and mark this so that it will map to the products table. So same as we done for categories. So I am marking the product table with a table attribute, and let's put the table name as TBL products. So one table is TBL categories, another table TBL products. I want the product ID as primary key, then I will mark this as key. Now comes very interesting and important point here is every product in the products table belongs to a specific category. That means in the categories table we have category ID and category name. If there should be a navigation property between the products and the category, that means I want to access the category ID as a foreign key in the products table. how you will designate a foreign key in a C# class. That is an interesting point here. So, in the products table, what we want is, we want a field called category ID, and this category ID should resemble a foreign key. That means whatever the primary key of categories table is, it should come here as a foreign key for navigation. So, how you will designate a foreign key here? Let us see a simple mechanism for that. So, I am making the access public and I am creating a type of category and let us name this as category. So, and a simple get set accessor. So, I am creating a property category. This category property is of type category. That means whatever the category ID that you whatever the primary key that you defined in this categories table, it will be used as a foreign key in this table. In the database tables, actually this field will be referred as category underscore category ID. That means the foreign key that you want to use in your table, that you can refer by using this method. So, just you have to create a type of what type? It is a category type. When you create a category type, that means this is referring to the foreign key of the categories table. So, exactly see what is happening here. This category is referring to a category type, and whatever the primary key is there in the category, the primary key in the category is category ID. This will be referred as a foreign key in the products table. So, how to designate a foreign key here? Just we have to create a type, that a property of the type that resembles the primary key of another table. So, then it will access that primary key of the table as a foreign key here. So, the products table is also ready and the categories table is also ready. So, we defined two important classes, one is categories, another one products. So, through these domain classes we are going to design two tables, one for categories and products. Now, we have to design a context. Already in our entity framework libraries, we discussed about three important classes: DB context, database and DB set. DB context is a collection of DB sets. You created two DB sets now, one is for category, another for products. Now, these are tables. Now, you need one context class which is responsible for communicating with the database. So, in the models already we are having two classes, one for category, another for product. This is resembling the categories table and products table. Now, we need one more class which will be responsible for communicating with the database. So, I am adding another class here, add a new class, and let us define the class name as Northwind context. Northwind context. Now, very important here is this context class is going to communicate with the connection string that you defined in the web config file. So, I am adding a context class. So, this context class should inherit the DB context type. So, we are importing a namespace using system.data.entity. So, this entity will provide you all the entity classes DB context, DB set and database. So, why you are creating a context class? Because context class will provide all the properties and methods that are responsible for communicating with a specific data source. You designed tables, but you haven't mentioned how to communicate, to which data source it has to communicate. The data source and all other descriptions we defined, the data source and all the descriptions we defined in the web config file. That means now this Northwind context should use a connection string defined in the web config file to communicate with the database. How this context file will communicate with the connection string? For that, it has to implement a DB context. You can go to the definition of DB context and see I will put the cursor in that and press F12 function key. You can see that DB context is a class which is having so many constructors overloaded with various functionalities. And here it is having a constructor which is accessing the DB connection and another constructor which is expecting the name of connection string. That means what we can do here is we can access the connection string by the reference of DB context. So, what we have to do here is create a constructor. We have to call the constructor of base class here. How do we call the constructor of the DB context here? So, we will create a Northwind context constructor. So, this constructor must call the constructor of base class where we have to pass the connection string. How do we call the base class constructor? Just we have to use the keyword base, and here we have to pass the name of the connection string. The connection string name is Northwind connection, that is the connection string name. That means now what we are doing is we are accessing the DB context, we are passing the name of the connection string through which you want to connect. That means whenever you create an object for this Northwind context, this object will be responsible for communicating with the connection string defined in this name. That means in the web config, if there is a connection string called Northwind connection, the Northwind context object will be responsible for communicating with the connection string. You can see that now here Northwind context is using a name Northwind connection, and in the web config file, let us see the web config file. In the web config file, there is a connection string by the name Northwind connection. You are referring this name in the context class. So, what a context class object will do? Context class object will be responsible with the data source that you have defined in this connection string. Okay. After connecting with the data source, it has to interact with two tables, one categories table, another one products. That means now it should have two DB set. One DB set is of what type? Category type. I will name it as a categories table. Okay. It will be responsible to read and write the values from the categories table. Another DB set is product table, and let us put the name as products table, and it will be responsible to get and set the values into it. Now, the DB context is having two DB sets. One is categories table, another one products table. So, you can communicate with the categories and products table by using these two DB sets. But these two DB sets are defined in the context class. That means in order to access them, you have to create an object for this context. A context class object can access these DB sets. One is categories table, another one products. And all our model classes are present in the library entity code first.models. So, all the model specifications are ready now. Let us run this and see how this is going to work now. So, exactly what we done here in the models, we created three important classes. One representing the categories table, another representing the products table, another is responsible for communicating with the database, that is the context one. So, now we will add a controller. Let us add a new controller. It is an empty controller. It is an empty controller. Let us name the controller as some Northwind controller. Okay. In this Northwind controller, by default there will be some actions. There will be an index action. We will use that index action to return some values. So, in this Northwind controller, by default we are having an action index which is returning a view. So, we have to access the model classes here. So, I am importing the library using entity code first.models. This will give access to the models. Whatever all available in the models, you can access them by using this library. So, what I want to do here is in the Northwind controller, first we need to establish connection with the database, and establishing connection with the database is the responsibility of context class. So, I have to create an object for context class. Our context class is Northwind context, db is equal to Northwind context. So, we are creating a db reference, so which is representing the Northwind context. That means now db is responsible for communicating with the database that is defined inside this connection string. Now, through db I want to access two tables when index is invoked, db.one categories table and return the list of all the values present inside it. Another, we want products table dot to list, return the list of all options inside the products table. And remember, the important point is still there is no database, there are no tables. Now, what you are trying to return, you are trying to interact with the database and tables which are never exist. So, what you are trying to do now is you are trying to create them by invoking them as a list. So, let us add a view for this index action. I am adding an absolute empty view for the index action, and in this view we will add a simple message that database is created or something else. Why? Because whenever I invoke this Northwind controller index action, Northwind controller index action will create a reference for db. Through that it will try to communicate with the tables, that is categories table and products. So, here I am just adding a simple heading saying that database created. Okay. Now, let us run the index action and see what happens. When you run the index action, actually this index action will try to communicate with the database that you defined in this context, and it will try to interact with the tables, categories and products. And interesting point here, you can see in our SQL databases still there is no database called Northwind. I will refresh, there is no database called Northwind. You are writing all the business logic. After writing the business logic, let us run this and see now. So, I will just run this index action and see. Now, when it tries to invoke the index action, first it will try to establish connection with a database, but it will find that there is no database in that specified location. And entity framework by default it uses a code first approach. In that situation, if database is not found according to the specified options, then it will create the database and it will create all the tables that are defined in your domain classes. Let us see how it will create the database and tables. So, when I run the index action, it is trying to invoke the database and it is trying to interact with the tables, but there is no database and tables there to interact. Then entity framework will use its default approach. And what is the default approach? Code first. In code first approach, what it will do is it will create all the database and tables that are defined in the domain specific classes of your application. Let us see how it will be done. I am running the Northwind controller. Here I am running the Northwind controller index action. This Northwind controller index action will invoke that index view and it will get me the output. Okay. Now, you can see it showing the message database created. Now, let us see what exactly happened in the database. So, I will switch to the SQL Server Management Studio and see in the databases I still have the same databases that I showed you before we started this example. Now, let us once refresh the databases and see, and you can interestingly find the database created by name Northwind. And this Northwind database you can expand and see there are tables, and we have two tables, one is categories, another one products. And let us see what is the fields generated into the categories table. Into the categories table there are two fields defined here, one is category ID and category name. And category ID is designated as a primary key. And see the products table. In the products table, interestingly, you will find the category ID as the foreign key. So, that means the product ID is the primary key, name and price, and the category ID is the foreign key. So, what exactly we done here is by using our domain specific classes, we created a database. So, database and tables. So, what is the entity framework code first approach? The entity framework code first approach, where you can write the domain specific classes and entity framework will generate the database and tables for those classes. If database and classes are ready, then it will try to communicate with the database and tables. So, this is one of the approach of entity framework. In our later sessions, we will see how to use a database first approach and model first approach. Keep watching NareshIT videos and please subscribe for more. Thank you.